Alrighty. Welcome everyone to our Lunch, Learn, Link seminar. It actually is the last one of 2019. And so I welcome you to come back in 2020. We still have 5 or 6 presentations all about cancer, and especially cancer in Maryland. So today we have a special guest, and it's a special opportunity for us. We will record the seminar. It's not being broadcast live, but you will be able to access it from YouTube. So if some of your colleagues have missed it or you want to actually review what Dr. Locke has said, you may go to YouTube. So today we have Dr. Paul Locke. He's an associate professor on the faculty of the Environmental Health and Engineering department, and a international expert on radiation and public health. And so he specializes in toxicology policy and radiation protection. We're covering this topic today because January is Radon month, and the state of Maryland in its cancer plan wishes to highlight unusual or rare exposures that influence the incidence of cancer in Maryland. And so radon has become one of those areas of interest, and because January is Radon month, and we will make it available during the month of January. There's a whole host of activities going on around radon during the month of January, so do check the website at the Maryland Department of Environment. And if we get a link, we'll actually post that where the YouTube notification is as well. So Dr. Paul Locke received a DrPH here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health and has become faculty in the School of Public Health. And we are very happy to have him today in our midst to talk about radon. So, Dr. Locke.
Thank you, Dr. Kanarek. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm going to talk about radon and going to discuss what the strategy should look like over the next 35 years to combat radon. But before I do, I want to give a special thanks to the Maryland Cancer Collaborative and, of course, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and my department, the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering, for providing me with this opportunity to talk to you today. I want to start out with a very direct statement, which is something that I feel strongly about after being a public health professional for longer than I'm going to admit to you. And that is that there are few public health problems like radon that are ripe for solving with only law and policy interventions. But we can do that with radon. That means that radon is something that we can combat and we can take on and we can fix the radon problem. So that's a very, very powerful thing for us as public health professionals to be able to do and focus on. And what I hope to do in the remainder of my talk today is really describe how we can go about doing that. So my presentation is organized into 5 different sort of areas. First, I want to talk about the beginning, how radon was quote unquote discovered as an indoor contaminant in homes. Then I want to talk about the scientific case for preventing radon exposure indoors. In other words, why radon is actually hazardous to our health. I'm going to focus on state and federal radon laws a bit and talk to you about some of the things that have happened in the federal and state programs, especially the shortcomings of the federal program. And I'm going to talk about Pennsylvania's radon program as a case study. For those of you that are geographically challenged, Pennsylvania is our neighbor in Maryland. You just got to drive, I think about, 30 or 40 miles, and you're right there. I'm going to discuss some lessons learned, mostly from the Pennsylvania program, and then I want to talk about how we need to have new and expanded policy tools for finishing the job. Before I do that, though, I'd like to say a little bit more about my background so you can understand where I'm coming from. First, what I really do here at Johns Hopkins is public health practice and research that works at the interface of science, law, and policy. In fact, I try to look at what happens when the research escapes from the journals and the labs and gets in hands of policymakers. And I also try to study how we can use laws, policies, and regulations most effectively, how we can deploy those as public health tools to make improvements, especially in environmental health, which is my field. I work in two substantive areas mainly, radiation protection and toxicology policy, as Dr. Kanarek pointed out. In radiation protection, my portfolio is quite broad. I've worked on everything from indoor radon, which I'm obviously talking about today, to space radiation. I've been to some of the most interesting, I think, places that have radiation issues. For example, I was at the Fukushima nuclear power plants. I've also been at a lot of our US legacy sites to look at high-level radioactive waste. But that's for another lecture and another time. But I did want to at least give you an idea of what my perspective and background is, because as I begin the presentation, what you're going to hear, I hope, is how you blend science, law, and policy together to solve environmental health problems. So I'm going to do a grand tour of the radon problem, as I said, from its discovery in homes in 1984, which was about 35 years ago. I'm going to suggest what tools have been used to try to combat radon. I'm going to talk about the radon science, and then I'm going to review the current statutes, and I'm going to look over what we have learned. So let's start out by going to the beginning. And as is appropriate with any historical discussion, I'm going to show you some black and white photos. So here you have two photos of a family. This is the Watrous family from Pennsylvania. And these pictures were probably taken sometime in the early 1980s. The picture that's on the top, that is the picture that came from the Allentown Morning Call, and you can see their logo across the picture. And the picture on the bottom is a picture from Getty Images. So why am I highlighting this family? So I need to tell you the Watrous story. Mr. Watrous was a nuclear engineer who was helping to build the Limerick nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. And Mr. Watrous would go to work every day, and if you've ever been to a nuclear power plant, when you go into the power plant, you immediately step through a radiation detector. And then you step through at the end of the day too, the idea being that they want to make sure that you have not been exposed to radiation in the plant. Okay, so Mr. Watrous was working on building the plant, and they actually put up the radiation detector and were testing it before they had any nuclear fuel in the plant at all. And the strangest things were happening to him. When he would walk through the radiation detector in the morning, he would set off the radiation detector. And then when he came through in the afternoon, nothing would happen. So this was a real mystery. Nobody really understood why this was happening. Well, it turned out the reason this was happening is because the Watrous family home had radon seeping into it. And it had very high levels of radon, in fact. So high that when Mr. Watrous left for work in the morning, the radon would adsorb. Remember, radon is a noble gas, so it doesn't chemically act, but it can adsorb to clothing. And it would adsorb to his clothing. And then when he would go through the radiation detector, it would set off the detector. He'd work there all day. Of course, the radon would disperse. And he'd come through and he wouldn't be radioactive anymore, at least not radioactive enough to set off the detector. So this really led Pennsylvania to a scramble on how to deal with this situation. So let's look at what they did. And of course, the first thing they did was they enacted a series of laws and they promulgated regulations along those laws. They also established a state-funded radon program within the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. They began to communicate with Pennsylvanians about radon's hazards, how to detect radon, how to fix it, what a radon problem could mean in terms of health, and they established a database to collect information about radon tests. So these were very important steps, and these were things that helped the state understand the radon problem. And to make a long story short, if you go to the Pennsylvania DEP website, which I hope you will, I have a screenshot of it here, you will find that because of some geologic formations that run through the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, most of the state has very high radon potential. There's something called the Redding Prong that runs through a lot of Pennsylvania that emanates quite a bit of radiation. So Pennsylvania really had to get out of the gates fast to mount their radon program. Now, at the same time that was happening, the federal government also began to study the radon problem because they quickly realized that there were many other states that had high potential radon areas because of the soil and the geology underneath those states, and that a federal program was really needed to coordinate things. So the federal government did several things. First, in 1986 and in 1988, Congress actually passed two laws, I'm going to discuss one in a minute, that were focused specifically on indoor radon. Then EPA began a series of other actions, and they began to work on communications to inform the public about the hazards of radon. They began to study how you fix radon, how you test for radon, to develop good methods to do those. And they also began to develop a network of partners, voluntary partners, to help them get the word out about radon. When the federal government started its radon program, it had a belief that if they informed the American public about the hazards of radon, and I'll discuss the radon science in a minute, that the American public would take action. So the program was entirely voluntary for the most part. And we'll see later why that just hasn't worked. This is the website for EPA's National Radon Program. And again, I encourage you to go to their website and look to see what EPA is doing and some of the tools they have. So let's fast forward. Let's get out of the 1980s and let's jump to about mid-2000s. How is EPA's program doing? Well, I'm lucky because I don't have to analyze that question myself. EPA's IG, Inspector General, actually did a report on EPA's radon program, which was published in 2008. And what that Inspector General looked at is how well EPA was achieving the statutory goals in the Indoor Radon Abatement Act. Now, you'll remember that was one of the laws that I mentioned earlier. And the Indoor Radon Abatement Act had several goals. One of the key goals was to make the radon levels indoors the same as the radon levels outdoors, which is approximately 1.3 picocuries per liter. And I know that measurement means nothing to you, but a short example of what a picocurie is, it's a measure of radiation activity in air. So it's not a measure of harm necessarily, it's a measure of what the radiation would be like in the air. It's a measure of emanations. EPA also set an action level under the Indoor Radon Abatement Act, the IRAA, of 4 picocuries per liter. And they also established a program looking at builders, looking at testing, and looking at several other features to try to build a radon system. So going back to EPA's Inspector General's assessment of the report, which came out in 2008, the Inspector General made a couple of interesting points. First, the Inspector General said that the radon problem is actually getting worse every year, that EPA is not keeping pace. EPA's voluntary program, while laudable, has not achieved its statutory goals. And it's time for EPA to look at other means, in other words, regulation, to bolster its program. So what should EPA do? The Inspector General was fairly clear about that. EPA needed to take some new directions to make its program stronger. In this next slide, I have a quote from the Inspector General's report. And it specifically targets the fact that EPA has not issued any regulations around indoor radon. And it points out that under the IRAA, while it doesn't say that EPA has to issue regulations, it says that EPA is not prohibited from issuing them either, and that perhaps it is necessary to do so to carry out the provisions of this law. The Inspector General concluded this paragraph by saying that 19 years after the IRAA was enacted, EPA has not proposed any indoor radon regulations. Quick update, we're 31 years out. still no regulations have been proposed. So I think it's safe to say that EPA is probably not going to adopt this recommendation by the Inspector General's office. EPA has never issued any regulations to carry out the provisions of the IRAA, and as a result, the radon problem does get worse every year, and we have not made progress. Now, to give you some idea about what this looks like, I wanted to just show you some data from the Inspector General's report. I'm sorry I don't have more up-to-date data, but I think this data would probably look even worse if I were able to get data that extended beyond 2005. And what you can see here is that there are approximately 70 to 75 million single-family homes in the United States. And of those, only a very small number have radon-resistant features, RRF. So that's quite a telling figure. I think that the percentage is somewhere around 2 or 3% of all homes. But even if you dial back and you look at the homes that have a radon action level that is above what EPA set, which is 4 picocuries per liter, and that's around 5 to 6 million homes, the penetrance of those radon-resistant features is still somewhere 15 to 20%. So again, data shows we are not really addressing this problem. So a key takeaway from the Inspector General's report, EPA needs to do more. What they're doing is not enough. And the radon problem in homes is getting worse. And EPA absolutely needs to use its regulatory authority to reduce radon's hazards. Okay, so let's stop there. And now that I've excoriated EPA using their Inspector General report, we'll move on to talk a little bit about the scientific case for radon prevention. Now, of course, it's very important because we do need to point out why radon is hazardous. So I want to take a little time to do that now and explain why radon is an issue. I also will point out that there have been thousands of articles written about residential radon. And I will freely admit that I haven't read all of them. I've tried to read most of them, and I'm not going to try to go through all of them today. I'm going to try to give some highlights from some of the consensus scientific studies that have been done so you can get a sense of the radon problem and the hazards that radon creates in the residential indoor environment. If you want more information, I'm happy to provide you with any or all of these articles. I also have a reference slide at the end that will give you some more places to look. So why is radon an issue? Well, first of all, you all probably know that we are exposed to radiation naturally. And we are exposed to radiation because there are beneficial uses of radiation that exist. For example, sometimes you need to go to a medical establishment and get a diagnostic X-ray, or you need to get a CT. So in about 10 years ago, the NCRP, the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements, did a study to look at what our average annual exposure to radiation is. And this pie chart shows that for most people in the United States, radon and thoron background contribute about 37% to our background radiation. So naturally occurring radon is a large source of our radiation burden. Now, as an indoor air contaminant, radon is a known human lung carcinogen, and there are very few compounds you can say that about. This statement is based on a series of very well-executed occupational epidemiologic studies and residential epidemiologic studies, and it's endorsed by national and international public health and scientific organizations like the IAEA, IARC, EPA, CDC, the US Surgeon General, and many more. So there's little doubt that the science supports the fact that radon causes lung cancer. Not only is this based on very strong epidemiologic evidence, but there are well-accepted biological models of disease progression. Those models show how radon causes damages because radon is an alpha emitter, both through direct DNA damage, but also through indirect impacts on increasing the inflammation pathway. And again, I don't have time to go into that here today, but I would be glad to direct you to articles about these biophysiological models that show how radon creates lung cancer. Again, the epidemiology is extensive. There are many studies that have been done in minors, and those were summarized by the National Academy of Sciences in a report which is short-handedly known as BEIR or BEER 6, which has nothing to do with any sort of liquid, but stands for Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, report number 6. And there are also pooled studies in homes, both in North America and in Europe. And they confirm, again, that radon is a known lung carcinogen. We also have studies from cells looking at radiobiology and how high LET radon, again, emits alpha particles. Alpha particles are high linear energy transfer radiation, how that high LET radiation damages cells and tissues. So there's strong consensus science, and I'm going to go to one of the reports that demonstrates this in a minute, ICRP report 115. And research continues. There are still epidemiologic studies that are ongoing, both environmental and occupational health, and there's a lot more going on in the world of radiobiology. But let's take a look at what at least one scientific consensus report says. So this is the ICRP, the International Commission on Radiation Protection, and in their report, they state that there is compelling evidence from cohort studies that residential radon exposures cause lung cancer. And I should also say that when I refer to radon, I refer to both radon and the radon progeny, because radon has a half-life of about 3.8 days, and it decays to a series of solid compounds, all of which are alpha emitters. So if you think about the way you would get radon, of course, radon is the only compound in the uranium decay chain that's a gas. If it builds up in your basement or in your home somewhere, you breathe it in. And when you breathe it in, of course, it's decaying. And as it decays, the gas particles decay at 3.8 days. They become solid particles, and those get lodged in your lung. And that's why radon causes lung cancer, because it lodges in your lung, and that energy from the radiation creates damage, either directly to the DNA or to cells in a way that increases inflammation. The ICRP is very clear about this. The other thing that the ICRP points out is that it shows that radon and lung cancer, the relationship persists even if you look at smoking. And in fact, to make matters worse, if you are a smoker and you are also exposed to radon, then your risk of lung cancer goes up submultiplicatively. So it's quite a bad actor when it is attracting lung tissue in people who smoke. And again, these results are consistent across a whole number of consensus science reports. So we know that radon, we have a biological model, we have epidemiologic data, we know that radon is a lung carcinogen. Let's take a little bit of a look at what the population of attributable risk of lung cancer mortality is of residential radon. So this is a study that recently came out that has data from 2002, and it actually looks at 66 countries, the PAR, population attributable risk across 66 countries. I pulled out 3 here. I pulled out the country with the highest PAR, the lowest PAR, and the United States. And what you can see here is that in the United States, the mean attributable cancer deaths to radon are about 21,000. And this estimate is consistent with EPA's estimate. If you go to EPA's website, you'd see the same thing. And that means that radon is associated with causing cancer in about 21,000 deaths, lung cancer deaths per year, that include both smokers and non-smokers. Clearly, most of those deaths are in smokers because, again, radon and smoking act in a submultiplicative fashion, but there are non-smokers who also are at high risk for cancer because of their radon exposure. And internationally, across this 66 study paper, there are approximately 226,000 lung cancer deaths that are attributable to radon. And that represents a median of 3% of total cancer deaths. So that's a high burden. I mean, that's a public health burden that we really need to pay attention to. All right, so I hope I've convinced you through that very quick tour of the science that radon is actually hazardous. But I do want to say my own personal opinion is, having worked in environmental health sciences for the past couple of decades, of all of the compounds I've worked with in terms of the scientific case, I think we have the strongest science implicating radon as a carcinogen than almost any other compound. The only compounds I think that actually come close in terms of level of evidence are things like asbestos and maybe benzidine in bladder cancer. So that we have a very strong base. Now, let's turn back to the policy. And let's look at Pennsylvania. Why Pennsylvania? Well, first, I hope I've convinced you from an early part of my talk that EPA has a radon program that, shall we say, is in stasis. They're not going to be advancing their radon program the way it needs to. So policy-wise, we have to turn to the states for action on radon. And because Pennsylvania was one of the first states out of the blocks, and it has a good radon program, at least I think it does, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Pennsylvania program looks like and some of the lessons we've learned from the Pennsylvania program. All right, so what are the Pennsylvania legal and policy tools? First, Pennsylvania has 3 primary laws that are now on the books. They have a law that is focused on consumer protection, and that's actually quite important because that law assures that when you live in Pennsylvania and you ask for a radon test, or you go to get a radon device to test, or you hire a radon tester, that you're getting professional services. No one will show up at your house with a mayonnaise jar with holes poked in it to tell you that they can test for radon. If they did in Pennsylvania, they could be actually fined. So that's the first thing. They have a strong consumer protection law. The second thing is they have a law that certifies all testers and all mitigators, the people who fix radon problems. Again, that's consumer protection, but it's also professionalism, because then you can control the techniques that these people use. And from a lot of other research that I'm not going to have time to go into today, we have a very, very good idea of what works to fix radon problems in homes. We know that something called sub-slab depressurization will, in almost all cases, reduce radon problems from very high levels to less than or equal to 2 picocuries per liter in the home. Finally, they have a law that's focused on real estate disclosure, that if you know the radon level when your home is being sold, you have to disclose it, but it doesn't require you to test. So those are 3 laws that they have on the books. Also, local ordinances, in other words, towns and counties, have something called RRNC ordinances. That stands for radon-resistant new construction. And what that means is that any home built in that town has to incorporate radon-resistant new construction features right into the home, so that the home will be built in such a way that right from the time the first person walks in and opens that door, there's going to be features in there that get the radon out of the home. In addition, the Pennsylvania program has additional resources that they bring to bear. Because they collect a lot of data, they have a radon zip code tool, and I'll tell you what that looks like in a minute, but they also do a lot of outreach. They have a program focused on newborns. They have a program looking at school events. They have a program with the builder community, and one where they actually go out and they do a random inspection of radon systems to make sure that they're in good shape. All this is based on the fact, too, that the department has a radon division with professionally staffed and trained people. So that's really key, because you need to have good people in the state hierarchy who can manage this program. So as I mentioned, Pennsylvania has this tool. If you want to know what the radon tests in your zip code look like, you can punch in your zip code and it'll show you. And this is, I believe this is a zip code. I just sort of, Pennsylvania zip code I picked randomly. But you can see that there's a fair number of basement tests and that the maximum result is very high. And the average result is even above the EPA action level. Again, this really emphasizes that radon is a problem in Pennsylvania. But this is a useful tool just to get a handle so citizens can understand what they're facing. So what are some of the lessons we've learned from Pennsylvania? Before I go into the lessons learned, I want to also let you know that I worked extensively in Pennsylvania, especially on real estate training. For more than 15 years, I did semi-annual real estate agent training in Pennsylvania around radon. I've been all over Pennsylvania, everywhere from Meadville to Philadelphia. Although there was no nuclear waste there, I did get to meet a lot of the state real estate professionals. So I'm familiar with that part of the program, and I've also had a chance to work with the people in the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but Hopkins and the Pennsylvania DEP signed a data sharing agreement. So we have access to their radon testing data from 1988 to 2013. And we've been fortunate to have students working on that data set, and we've had some papers published on that, some in the process, and I'll, again, explain that in a little more detail when I get to some of the later slides. But let's look at some of the other things we've learned from Pennsylvania. So first, almost all areas of the state we've learned have high potential for radon. Using the data that Pennsylvania collected, they've been able to actually pinpoint resources to higher levels in Pennsylvania because, of course, like every public health program, the radon program is resource limited. So you want to maximize your resources. So data plays a very important role here in identifying radon problem areas. Testing has also revealed some extremely high radon homes. Within the last 2 years, there have been some tests in new Pennsylvania homes that have showed radon levels above 6,000 picocuries per liter. So if you do the math, that's at least 3 magnitudes of order above the action level, very high. And the state has been able to identify them, they've been able to go in, they've been able to study those homes, and they've been able to mitigate those homes. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania has a tradition of consumer protection with their radon services by licensing radon professionals and making sure radon devices work properly. The state really protects consumers from shady practices and shoddy workmanship. Radon service providers have to be of high caliber in Pennsylvania. They also, as I mentioned, have the ability to enforce and punish and police to remove bad actors from the system. Again, data plays a role in helping think about what the next steps are too. So there's the publicly available radon database, which citizens can use to understand what radon levels look like in their area. But there's also academic research collaborations. As I said, we have one, and as of the present, we have 2 doctoral dissertations that were based on this data. We've had 1 undergraduate dissertation that's been based on this data. And I'm fortunate to be working with a very talented SCM student who's going to also be involved with that data. We have published a paper on radon-resistant new construction and its effectiveness. Another student looked at how you communicate with communities that self-identify as Hispanic to get them to do more on radon. Another student looked at radon cost effectiveness. So all of this work came out of our data sharing agreement, and it allows us, again, to think about how to improve programs and improve public health. Another thing we've learned about from the Pennsylvania program is it's very important to have trained professionals within the state DEP or Department of Health to address questions. I mentioned the high radon home issue. They also staff a hotline, so if citizens have questions, somebody in the hotline can talk to them who actually knows a lot about radon. And there is active targeted outreach and communications. So there are videos that are available through Pennsylvania. And of course, Pennsylvania always does something special, as do many states, for Radon Action Month. As Dr. Kanarek mentioned, Radon Action Month is January. So for those of you that are listening to this in January, go test your homes now, if you haven't already. Despite the fact that Pennsylvania has a very good program, there are clearly challenges that remain. So what are some of those challenges? The first challenge is that there's still a lack of comprehensive testing for radon in dwellings. Radon, again, testing is voluntary. It's not required. Many people do, but most people don't. So we do need to figure out a way to get more testing in residential structures. The second problem that has emerged is that there is a lack of radon protection in schools and public buildings. This involves two very key populations who we want to protect: people who work in schools, educators, staff providers, as well as children. And high levels of radon have been discovered in schools. But again, school testing is not mandatory for the most part, so we don't have a lot of knowledge, and if we don't have knowledge, we can't fix the problems. Fixing school buildings is, of course, more complicated than fixing homes because they're larger buildings with very complex HVAC systems, but it can and has been done. We also have very limited protection for people who rent dwellings. If you rent a dwelling and you discover a high radon level, you yourself probably cannot fix it for a number of legal reasons as well as resource reasons, and your landlord has no responsibility to inform you of what the radon level is. Also, federal resources are quite constrained. There is a federal program that EPA set up to provide states with money for radon, but the level of money that's been available in that program has remained stagnant for probably the last decade and maybe longer. So you know what that means. In terms of real dollars, that's actually falling. So we know that a lot needs to be done, and these are really areas we can focus on. And now I'd like to turn and look at some of the policy tools and legal tools that we can use to get to the next stage. What should our strategy be moving forward to actually solve the radon problem? So these are probably going to be very obvious to you from the last slide, but I'd like to talk through them in any event. The first thing is we do need protection for students, workers, and teachers in schools. That will require legislation, and it will require resources. But Pennsylvania and every state should adopt a law that requires testing in schools, and also, more importantly, the disclosure of those test results to the people who are affected by them, the students, their families, and the workers. In addition, there should be required testing in all home sale transactions. If you think about it, the home sale transaction may not be the perfect time to test for radon, but it's a good opportunity. You have a situation where if you have to test for radon and those results have to be disclosed to buyers and sellers, the market will take care of remediating radon. Market forces, if it's a seller's market, the buyer will probably have to remediate. If it's a buyer's market, the seller might have to remediate. But if that knowledge is out there, it's something that can be folded into the negotiation. Now, some of that is happening in Pennsylvania and other states now, but there's no requirement for testing and disclosure. There should be a requirement in all home purchase and sale transactions. The third thing we need to do is we absolutely need to have a law and regulations that protect renters. Renters are always at a disadvantage in terms of their housing because, of course, the landlord writes the lease and the renters frequently have little to say about the lease. But the legislature needs to step in here and really provide some protection for renters so that the laws change in a way that allows the renters to understand what the radon levels in their homes are and requires landlords to take those radon levels to a safe level if they're not at that level. There needs to be more effective communication about radon. And this might not necessarily require a law, but it certainly requires research and effort. Communicating with diverse populations is quite challenging. One of our doctoral students learned this when she studied radon communication among populations that self-identify as Hispanics. That population has a different way of getting information. It has, of course, there could be a language barrier. They don't really have the same level of awareness about radon that people who are outside of that community do. So we need to fix that problem. We also need to do a much better job educating our legislators about radon and why radon protection is important for public health. There should also be required mandatory radon-resistant new construction standards for every new home built in Pennsylvania and every state. Right now in Pennsylvania, there are only between, I think, 8 and 10 jurisdictions that have required RRNC. That needs to change. That way, every new home will come out of the building process with a system in it that will reduce radon. And finally, we need to have a lower radon action level. The EPA's radon action level, which was set in the late 80s, early 90s at 4 picocuries per liter, was not set because of health-based concerns. It was set because at the time, EPA felt that technology in terms of remediation and testing could only reliably deliver 4 picocuries per liter of protection. But research has shown that that's not the case. In fact, testing and technology can get us down to 2 picocuries per liter. And that's what the new action level should be, in my opinion. And by the way, that's much, much, much closer to what is required under the Indoor Radon Abatement Act, which seeks to make the level indoors the same as the level outdoors, which is about 1.3 picocuries per liter. So these are, I think, the 6 things that need to be done in terms of policy, law, and regulation. These are the tools that we need to move forward to make sure that we can solve the radon problem in the next 35 years. So I want to just summarize. Radon was discovered as a problem in houses in Pennsylvania in 1984. Since that time, scientific research has consistently demonstrated that radon is a known lung carcinogen. So the science is quite clear. Within really a couple of years after its discovery, states such as Pennsylvania, as well as the US federal government, enacted radon laws and established governmental programs and policies. An evaluation of EPA's radon program about 11 years ago by its Inspector General showed that the EPA program was not keeping pace and was actually failing to address the radon problem. In other words, the radon problem was getting worse. Since that time, EPA has not adopted the suggested changes that the Inspector General pointed out they needed to, and its program has really remained static. As a nation, we need to continue to fight radon, and we can't afford to fall further behind on addressing residential radon exposure. It makes sense for the states to take the lead in addressing this public health problem. The state can adopt laws, regulations, and policies to tackle indoor radon. Pennsylvania is an example. They currently have a strong radon program, and if you look at its successes and its challenges, it shows what I think needs to be done. Legislative and policy change is needed in 6 areas. 1, requiring school testing. 2, requiring testing at the time of home sale. 3, establishing policies to protect renters. 4, lowering the radon action level to 2 picocuries per liter, which is achievable using current technology. 5, requiring radon-resistant new features in all homes. And 6, developing better communication policies. The global and U.S. cancer mortality burden from residential radon exposure is substantial. If these 6 actions were taken by the states, that could be, I think, largely eliminated. It might not take 5 years, but I think we could do it in another 35 years. We could get the housing stock under control, and we could sweep this problem out and move on to some of the really, really major challenges we have as public health and environmental health professionals. These 6 steps should be the basis of any strategy that underlie our goal of protecting public health. They will require lobbying and advocacy, but they are achievable. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for coming and your attention. I'm glad to take any questions.
I have the microphone and we have some time for questions. So I'll bring it around to anyone. So our first one is, questioner is down here.
Paul, thank you very much. I really appreciate the lecture. The question is very broad, and it's more of a statement, but gives you a chance to answer it as well. Radon was something that Pennsylvania grabbed onto, did something for several years, and then it stopped. You pointed it out, it stopped about 11 years ago. Mm-hmm. I'd love to know if you could correlate that with any other event that caused that stop, but we can go there. But I think what you've demonstrated is a policy approach to major public health problems. And I would love to see the same kind of analysis that you've done with Radon on climate change. What are the policy approaches to changing what we have? We know the politics of this country right now is toxic. Okay, there's a brilliant article on why some of that is the case in the New York Times when it's written about Bill Barr. That's a hint to some of you might want to read that. New York Times, Bill Barr. But I think it's really the time to take a look at a policy approach, not from getting into the laboratory at this point, but what is it that we need that will close this circle from the education to the laws? So thank you.
Sure. So just to reiterate, there are really 2 radon stories here. The EPA federal government radon story is a story of stasis. They developed a program. It was looked over by their inspector general, which actually puts me as a researcher in a very nice place because I am not criticizing the agency through my own research. I'm actually criticizing an agency because of its internal research. And the inspector general said, you're not doing enough. And EPA has, for whatever reason, decided that they are not going to take the next step. I think the reason they're not taking the next step is because of political will, because we don't have any legislative champions in Congress and in the executive branch who really want to fix this problem. Now, Pennsylvania, on the other hand, has had much more of a slow and steady beat and a very strong fundamental program, which is based on consumer protection. It's based on making sure there are radon professionals available, having people in the state available to answer questions, and data. So to get more to your question, one of the things I think that has strengthened our ability to at least figure out how we can move forward on radon is the fact that we have such strong data. And what I have noticed is that whenever there's an environmental health problem in particular that is sensitive, and there are forces that do not want that problem discussed or solved, science is at the chopping block. So I have some personal experience with this because I was chairing a National Academy of Sciences committee looking at the potential health effects of surface coal mining in Appalachia. And that study was essentially canceled by the current administration. We would have probably been able to study that problem and offer some thoughts about how to address some of those issues, but now we have nothing. So what you really need is you need a strong database. You need to be able to have people who can analyze the data, and then you need to have people who can explain what that data means in terms of policy changes. For climate change, I think we are developing that. I think one of the things that might be the bright spots about climate change is that there are localities and states that take climate change quite seriously, that study climate change and its impacts on their population's public health, and they are acting. The federal government has not. They have taken the opposite tack, but there's always the opportunity for them to change direction.
So Dr. Locke, in the vein of looking at policies, what do advocates need when they go to the legislature or go to a department to, advocate for a certain policy? I can imagine, but are there some thoughts there, that might be taken to the national level?
Sure. I think I can think of 5, things I would suggest that any advocate should consider. The first one is pretty obvious: know your own research. But know your own research and understand its impact from a policy perspective. When you go to a legislator, don't present your research like you're going to a scientific meeting. The second thing you have to do is you have to know the research of people who might not agree with you. And you have to understand that research, and you have to either be able to distinguish your research from their research, or you have to show why their research isn't as impactful as your research. The third thing you have to do is you have to understand the research of almost everybody in your field, because none of us have totally occupied any field of research. So research synthesis across an area is quite important. So for example, I've published on radon-resistant new construction, I've published on radon laws and policies, but when I go to advocate about radon, I actually have read widely on these topics because a lot of people have published on them. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing you have to do is you have to develop a strong sense of how to be vague and accurate. As scientists, we're not always good at that. We're very good at writing 30-page papers, but we're not very good at writing page synopses of science. And boy, that's tough. It requires word choice. It really requires a different way of thinking about your scientific research. And the fifth thing I would say is you need to be able to align yourself with organizations that are going to help you amplify your message. So as a scientist, when I go to, for example, the US Congress, I try to represent what the science says, and I try to be an honest broker of what the science says. And I usually try to find advocates who agree with me, and I also try to find out who might not agree with me. So those are the 5 things I think we need as advocates. It's doable, and those are learnable skills.
Paul, thank you for that. Was a great presentation. You had mentioned that the Inspector General had said that the problem was getting worse with time, and maybe you can talk about it. My understanding was that it was mainly because there were more and more new constructions without this, the RRNC features in them. And why is that? And why is that like political opposition from the building and construction industry mainly? So that was my first question. And the second one was what Alan referred to as toxic politics in this country. How are things in Europe where, at least at setting a continent away, the politics seem less toxic?
Let me address your second question first, because I only know a little about it, but I'm just going to tell you what I know. I haven't studied extensively what's going on in Europe, but the EU does have a radon directive, and they have a requirement. So countries that are part of the EU are transpositioning to adopt radon protective strategies. I don't know how effective those are yet or what they're going to look like, but they do have something. So in this country, why are we losing ground? So if you think about the 3 kind of baskets of housing, first, on the rental lease side, there's no protection at all. So people who are renting houses, and anytime a new rental unit comes on, there's nothing there to protect them from high radon levels. In terms of radon-resistant new construction, we don't have a very high penetrance of radon-resistant new construction. So any new homes built, some are going to have RRNC, but most won't. The third thing is in homes that are being sold, there's no requirement in homes that are being sold to test and fix for radon. So every time a home turns over, there's another group of people that could be potentially exposed to high radon levels. So the larger the housing stock gets, the more the radon problem increases, because we don't have the policy tools to really make a difference in raising testing and fixing rates. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I was asking about the building and construction industry.
The building and construction industry argues that, they argue several things, because I have spoken with them about this. The first thing they argue is that public health is not their job. The second thing they argue is that their constituency works in what they call an inelastic environment. So any costs they add to the house is going to be borne by them. They can't pass it on. And the third thing that they say is that, and this I hear commonly, and it's a very interesting argument. They say that if radon were really serious, the government would regulate it. So it's very interesting because it's a sort of a catch-22 situation where you hear this, well, if this stuff were serious, the government would regulate it. And when you go to the government to try to get them to regulate it, you can't get any traction. But that's the same thing, by the way, with the real estate industry. The real estate industry has been, we've worked with them. They've been pretty good about helping to add voluntary language. But if you talk to them about making something mandatory, they're worried that it might be a disincentive for people to buy and sell homes.
Do you have some cost figures for any of this? So the testing, remediation, and then building a home so it can be remediated if need be?
I have some rough cost estimates. The first thing to know is that, like anything in home building, it's much less expensive to put something in to begin with than it is to retrofit. So I believe the cost of putting in a radon-resistant new construction in a single-family home is somewhere between $700 and $1,000, more or less. Putting in a radon-resistant new construction feature into an existing home is more expensive, can be between $1,500 and $3,000. That now, putting in radon-resistant new construction in more complex buildings like schools or office dwellings, that can be much trickier and might be much more expensive. And putting radon-resistant new construction features in large buildings that have a lot of rental units, I don't even know what the cost of that would be. I don't have any estimate on that at all.
The story of a apartment building, you're not dealing with a radon issue.
Most radon issues, radon, as I understand it, is heavier than air as a gas. So most radon problems occur in basements or on the first floor. However, there are many exceptions. And because the way the radon travels through a structure is going to depend on how the structure is built and how the pressure gradient in the structure changes. So there could be radon problems higher up. It's unusual, but it could happen. The only way to know is to test.
Another question?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Locke. So my question will be that it's kind of related to the existing houses. So if we are not getting to a real estate house exchange for the existing house, do you think the federal government or the local government, they are responsible to provide a promotion program or provide a special discount for those house owners to do their own RRNC so that they will no longer get exposure to radon?
Yeah, that's an interesting strategy, and that could be another strategy to deal with the radon problem. If I understand what you're saying correctly, is you might want a tax incentive so that if, let's say, you remediate a house, you get a tax credit like you used to get if you bought a Tesla or an electric vehicle. Or there might be a loan program, a low or no interest loan program, so that if you put in a radon system, you could borrow from this fund and pay the funds back without paying any interest or paying very low interest. Or there might be a free program. In Pennsylvania, they have tried some of those. Again, those are resource constrained and resource limited. And that, by the way, is another reason why a lot of schools don't want to test, is because if they discover a problem, what do you think happens? They have to fix it. And their argument is, this is not part of our budget. So it's a good point. I mean, I think we could do more in terms of providing incentives. Most of the policy options I spoke about were what are known as sticks. Here are things that we're going to prevent people from doing or force people to do. But what you mentioned are carrots, and those we're going to give people something to encourage their behavior. And those are good ideas as well.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Okay. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for that. You've definitely heightened my paranoia about possible radon in my house. I'm in a very old house, built in 1920. I spent quite a bit of time down my basement entertaining, and I have cracks in my walls where water kind of seeps through. And so what I'm wondering is, you see, I've been there for maybe like 15 years. Is there any data that you're aware of that says, okay, if you've been in a house for 24 or 20 or so years, that what is the likelihood that you may have been, exposed to radon, depending on if it's at the lower levels or, higher levels, or, is there an incidence or any data on that?
Do you have cement floors or dirt floors in your house?
Cement floors.
Okay. So the only way to really know is to test your home. Once your home is tested, it'll come back with a radon level, and then you can extrapolate based on time of exposure and the radon level to figure out what your risk might be. That being said, a lot of the newer homes that have been built tend to be quote unquote tighter, and the tighter homes tend to have pressure gradients that actually, radon is a soil gas. It draws radon up from the soil. So some of the older homes, which aren't as tight, in a way, are beneficial because they might not have the same pressure gradient. But again, the only way to know is to test.
Okay.
A home test kit at Lowe's probably costs, I think it probably costs $20, but it might cost a little more. It's not very expensive. And those are, you should look and make sure those are certified by EPA or certified by the state.
And what do you do? Do you send the testing off somewhere, or is it just like a little box that says, yes, you have radon, you have a bunch of it, and you've been exposed, or?
There are several different types of tests. There are charcoal canisters, there are EPERMs, there are electret tests. What they give you is a static point estimate of your radon. So if there are devices that'll measure radon over time. And if you looked at those devices, you would see a graph that jumps because radon fluctuates. But these tests integrate all that. And what you do is you put them in your home. You have to obey certain conditions like closed house conditions, which is not a problem now because I don't think most of us are opening our windows a lot. And then you put them in there for a number of days. At the end of that time, you seal the test kit, you send it off to the lab. The results they send back to you will tell you what your radon level is. It'll say, 1, 3, 5, 7 picocuries per liter.
Could you say one word, Dr. Locke, about the exposures in Maryland where you might be most likely to live that would have the radon in the soil itself?
Unfortunately, Maryland has not, in my opinion, a very good history for radon. Back in the 90s, the state defunded its radon program, much to my chagrin. There is a map of every state called a radon potential map, which divides counties into 3 zones, zone 1, 2, or 3. Zone 1 is the highest potential, zone 3 is the lowest potential. So that could give you some information. However, the only way to know whether you have radon is to test. What has happened is in some of the zone 1 counties, we found very high houses. So it's very dependent on the way your house is built, the soil underneath the house, and a whole bunch of things. I hope that Maryland has reestablished its radon program and will do more with radon because it is a public health hazard. And those of you out there who are from Maryland, there's nothing that constrains you from going and testing your home right now. You can go and buy a test kit. You can hire a professional radon tester to do it for you and fix the problem. But unfortunately, right now, the state of Maryland may not have the same resources that other states have to help citizens.
Okay. Could you go to the last slide with your references on it? I want to be sure we show that to our audience as well.
Yes.
There you go. And so if some of you are viewing the recording, you can blow it up and grab the reference.
And we can make these slides publicly available so that people can actually use the hot links to get these articles as well.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much for coming today. You're a local resource for us, so appreciate all of that.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. Thanks, everyone. And don't forget to test your home for radon and fix it if you have a radon problem.